right.
What up?
What's up?
How are ya?
I'm doing pretty well. Just
Yeah.
just getting through the busy day.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Well,
It's
you're 3 hours behind, so you still have
I'm in
things.
the thick of it. I'm
Yeah,
in the thick of it right now. Yeah, we had an
you're like
extra early morning of starts. Yeah.
you're in the time where you're just contemplating everything and if you're gonna make it through the rest of the day.
Yeah. So the most check-ins are done, but we're in like a place of like changing protocols or like new
Yep.
client stuff, like the thinking parts.
Yep.
So there's
Yep.
there's so many options sometimes. It's like, what am I gonna, which is awesome, right? It's like what we're talking
Right.
about today. It's kind of, which one am I gonna do here and at what time? And like, that's where that attention to detail really.
So let's see here. Oh, finger in front of them. It's my Wi-Fi. Okay, I think we're good.
Yeah.
Getting some people jumping on here. It looks like. Sweet. So we are going to talk on GI testing.
Yeah.
So, contrary to popular belief, like there are other ways that you could potentially spot a GI issue outside of just a GI map. So we can talk about like other
Yeah. I
things
think
that we could maybe
serum
see.
labs is such a great way because serum meaning blood labs, because a CBC, which is the complete blood count, will show you a pretty good idea of what's going on virally, bacterially, inflammation. It's not necessarily like this is exactly what strain and which overgrowth, but you can get a
Correct.
really good idea of gut health on a CBC, which is about $10 if you're paying out of pocket. It's normally what they run at every doctor runs a CBC. He's like, you're fine, you don't need anything else. That will tell you a lot
Right.
if you know what to look for. So like you can look at your white
Yeah.
blood cell count. You can see that is, and that has a lot of influence too. I think that I've definitely had people who've like listened to podcasts or gotten a little bit of education in like throughout functional health, and they'll say, oh, my white blood cell counts are high. You have to take into consideration the prior 4 weeks of getting labs too when looking at like white blood cell count. If you just had like a cold recently, or I have a client and she got sick, and so we were just kind of expecting things to be a little bit more elevated, these things matter. But when we look at things like lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils, that's where we can get a good idea of like, okay, what type of white blood cells are doing what? It's kind of like, I always think like we're all Americans, but we're all from different states, right? And we're all going to be slightly different. So that's kind of how I think about like lymphocytes, monocytes, basophils, eosinophils. So they all have different things that they bring to the table, and in different percentages they have different meanings. So like, let's just say one would be more like it's fighting a virus. So the more of that specific one we see, we know this person might have something like mono or Epstein-Barr, where something specifically more like lymphocytes, sometimes when those are high, we can say, well, maybe there's like some system toxicity going on, like eosinophils. High eosinophils normally means we've got some dysbiosis going on, some sort of overgrowth of normally bad bacteria, possibly a parasite. So we can look at these different labs, and while we don't have the exact strains, we can get a better idea, which I think is a really good first level if we don't have a straightforward SIBO case, because we might just need to look at labs and we go, this isn't actually too bad. Maybe we support with digestive support. Maybe we work on lifestyle habits around eating. What are we eating? If we cut protein down, if we chew our food, maybe a little apple cider vinegar, like, can we do a lot there if these labs look pretty good? If I have some of these labs look pretty wicked, I'll probably, and depending on what low-hanging fruit we can address.
Right. Yeah. So the other thing we're looking at on serum labs and the kind of the catch-all term of inflammation, right? So like we know if there's inflammation present, there's probably a gut component, probably like 99% of the time. So
Just
you
with
won't,
cholesterol even.
right. So some things that you're going to see that can indicate like sluggish motility, slow thyroid, which thyroid's normally an indirect, like thyroid dysfunction is almost always indirect from something else, right? Antibodies, things like that. So things like seeing dyslipidemia, like just high lipids in the absence of things like what a person that probably shouldn't be insulin resistant, right? Like seeing high glucose, seeing high insulin levels. So seeing this like metabolic syndrome-esque looking blood work, which metabolic syndrome, essentially, for those that don't know, is just kind of a cluster of issues. So dyslipidemia, insulin resistance, and then the lump in like high blood pressure and stuff as well. But seeing that, of course, other things that you might see elevated, like sluggish liver function, things like that might be an indicator. So not always liver enzymes, like LDH is another one that we might see flagged, that will show, these are showing tissue damage, but technically they're like markers of tissue damage. But we know that if we're having someone not trained for 2 days or something like that, like we shouldn't see a lot of tissue damage, right? So we know that there's inflammation present. Of course, CRP is a measure, even though that's more of an arterial inflammation measure. It is an acute reactant to infections and things like that. So we would see that potentially elevated. So I mean, there's a ferritin, like high ferritin levels on our iron panel. I mean, there's so many things on serum labs that would just give you an indication. And then, of course, just looking at the symptoms of the client, you can kind of start piecing things together.
Yeah, we can start to see things like low protein totals and stuff like that. You'll see people consuming, 200 grams of protein a day, but their protein totals at like 6, 5.9. We can assume that this person has like low stomach acid, hypochlorhydria, a hard time breaking down and absorbing nutrients. You can start to put together, like Austin said it, like you can get an idea of like across the board, like this person has a poor time absorbing nutrients, poor protein breakdown. And then you pair it along with their symptoms, because labs aren't the end all be all. We really have to think of people as like human beings. Like, okay, yeah, we've talked about this, Austin. We've seen people cycle on 2 progesterone, and I've seen people cycle on 12 progesterone. Okay.
I don't know what is going on.
This is very strange.
Yeah.
This is very strange stuff happening right now. I have no idea. I moved into the living room, so I was like, maybe it's the office, but I just kept seeing the circle of death, but we made it here.
Okay. So I took the part 1 with the serum labs and I posted it. That way people can still watch it. But yeah, so let's go back into, let's actually go into GI mapping now and talk about that a little bit, because that's what everyone's going to want to know the most about, probably.
It's cool.
Right. Because I think I think that GI mapping is kind of like the new Dutch test. Like there's still a lot of people that don't do it and don't know a lot about it.
Yeah.
I remember when the Dutch test was kind of like that. There's still a lot of people that don't do that also, but when that kind of came into its infancy and people were starting to learn, and now we're moving into the GI map. So the one that is most commonly used is going to be the one from Diagnostic Solutions. I would say is probably like the most commonly used one. That's the one that you see us probably talk about.
Yeah.
For the most part.
That is like the GI map. There's the Zoomer, and then there's the Genomic.
There's some others.
Yeah.
Yeah. The GI map, I think, is easiest to read and navigate. Personally, I like stick with that.
I think it's very like specific in the sense of like it's like not entry level by any means, but it's very specific into like, okay, these are the systems directly that are affected. We can see immune health. We can see how the gallbladder is working. We can see pancreatic enzymes, how those are working throughout the body. We can kind of see the different systems, as well as kind of like opportunistic bacteria. So things that are going to be have a better opportunity to like overgrowth and create chaos, and things that are going to be more beneficial. So that are like repopulating, healing, protective in the gut, as well as things like C. diff and E. coli, which we do get cases where we have that in people and it's maybe missed by a doctor just because of specifically how we test the stool in a GI map.
Right. So what a GI map is, for those that don't know anything about it, is a stool collection. I always say it looks like the, when you go to the carnival or like the fair and you get like the little food tray that has hot dogs or whatever it has in it, onion rings or whatever the fuck people eat. That's what it looks like. So it's a collection. It's not always a great process because people have diarrhea and all kinds of other fantastic stuff going on, but that's what it is. So at-home kit, relatively easy to do, send back out, so on and so forth. So what it's going to show us a handful of things primarily. I also like it because it does cut out a lot of the fluff that some of the other tests I think have in them that I don't really find useful. So we're going to see things like our baseline stuff that we're looking at most often are commensal bacteria or normal bacteria and opportunistic bacteria, which would be like dysbiotic bacteria, right? So it's giving you ranges and showing you red for overgrowth on there, pretty easy. And you can see how much overgrowth there is and how many things are overgrown. You're also going to see H. pylori and also the virulence factors to show you if this H. pylori is active in the body. You'll get to see parasites or potential parasites, common ones, immune markers. So these will show things like immune function, possible blood in the stool, like enzyme levels, things like that, as well as pathogens that could be present. That's normally the top section of the test. Pathogens that are present in the blood or in the stool. So,
and then autoimmune triggers. So like things that have molecular mimicry.
Yeah.
So like if this person's having an autoimmune issue and we look at the gut, which most autoimmune cases have a tie into the gut, we can say like, okay, was this a triggering factor for this autoimmune disease? Like we see this with RA a lot, rheumatoid arthritis a lot. There's normally some sort of like dysbiosis there or overgrowth of some of these specific strains that basically send out messages when they leak through the gut. The body says, wow, there's this XY thing, Z going on. Let's attack the body. Therefore, it's this autoimmune thing, the body attacking itself, almost like an invisible phantom, like a ghost, right? And we see that. I really like the GI map because it shows very easily, it's like, this is the good stuff, this is the bad stuff, and you can understand like gram positive and gram negative bacteria, and you can really plan your gut healing protocol around that. Like, is this person going to have DIF symptoms? Is that something I need to take into consideration? Or is this pretty manageable? A lot of these guys aren't necessarily, gram negative bacteria.
Right. And kind of a little caveat on the autoimmune stuff. Well, I'm going to give you a caveat on all of the bacteria. So if you look up, you can potentially research like each specific strand if you really wanted to. You're going to see, based on what literature we have, like these strands are connected to these diseases, these ailments, so on and so forth. That does not mean you have these things. So I always tell people that because sometimes people will get their GI map and they'll start Googling before I see it, right? Yeah. And they're like, do I have
insulin resistance? And like, it's like,
no. What we know about this is these certain strands will be more abundant in people that have those issues. Yes. That's what it is. Right. It's not like a cause and effect thing necessarily. Yeah. Same with autoimmune markers. You don't necessarily have an autoimmune disease if you have an autoimmune flag.
Yeah.
Marker. That's just a bacteria.
ANA with gut issues. ANAs are an autoimmune marker that will test with there's some sort of suspected autoimmune disease going on if we're looking for like missing illnesses. And I've seen this get flagged and then dissipate post gut healing protocol.
Right. So don't freak yourself out if you're trying to research all the specific bacteria. So the one thing that the GI map doesn't do specifically, like another test that we could talk about, is it doesn't like say yes you have SIBO or don't have SIBO. That's the one that everyone kind of wants, as everyone's looking for a lot of the time, is SIBO. It does test Candida, so you can see yeast overgrowth on there. However, we can assume we can make some assumptions based on overgrowth. So think of most of our bacteria is housed in the intestinal tract, right? So what we can assume when we start seeing a lot of dysbiotic overgrowth or a disproportionate overgrowth of dysbiotic bacteria and normal bacteria is we can assume that that's located in the intestinal tract, which would give us an indication of possible small intestine bacterial overgrowth, right? It doesn't necessarily tell us where it's at, but the stomach or the actual stomach itself doesn't have a ton of bacteria in comparison. Certain strands, but they don't live very well in there in comparison. So,
and they normally multiply the more time that it has, like the stool, the more time the stool has, like moving through the body, you'll see things multiply, which is
like slow motility.
To mind. Yeah, it's even important to keep in mind, like when you're taking the test, are you on killers when you're taking the test? Were you sick recently? Like there's factors. I mean, we're looking at the stool in one moment in time. It's like a representation of like the past 48 to 72 hours of like what was going on. But it's a lot can influence that specific stool test.
Right. And it's always important to match with symptoms, I mean, like if someone were, for some reason, they took the test, and this does happen, this happens with Dutch tests, this happens with blood work, they're super sick or they have a really couple bad days or something, they decide to take their test like right after it, and things are flagged.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, bacterial overgrowth in a chronic sense, like it's going to take time to create mass and dysbiosis, but you could definitely have an acute reaction to, like, because microbiome changes constantly. It's changed a million times since we've been sitting here talking.
Yeah.
Right.
And dietary changes. So like, this is important too. Like when you're changing a diet right away, like let's just say you're eating high protein and now you're like, oh, I'm going to introduce this like more ketogenic lifestyle or like big switches like that. It's going to take your gut a while to adjust because all of those specific bacteria were based around the dietary needs that were, coming in before and breaking down that food. And quick dietary changes like that will absolutely change your gut microbiome. Prep changes your gut microbiome. You're eating very specific foods all the time. That's why we always try to encourage like a robust diet with lots of variety, especially in these healing cases, because those things do matter.
Right. So this isn't as common with our population, but, potentially if you work with Gen Pop people, you would want to consider lifestyle and, poor dietary habits and things as the reason that their GI map looks the way that it does, because that doesn't necessarily mean you need a protocol of any extreme, like maybe some basic support. But, with competitors or people that are more tracking and following more specific diets, we have a little bit more consistency there. So it's a little bit easier to make assumptions. But if someone comes in off the street and they have a terrible GI map and they've been eating fast food 3 times a day, that's probably why.
As a coach, I probably wouldn't run a GI map until,
right. Sure.
Like,
yeah, I wouldn't even waste, I personally wouldn't waste money on it.
It's funny, like the more I grow, the more I'm like, there's some things I'm like, let's test right away. But sometimes I'm like, let's just clean up lifestyle and diet first. And then let's like go over symptoms. And if we're still having some of these, let's go ahead and test. Sometimes these tests come back and it's like, we can change a lot with very little. We don't always need, honestly, we don't always need antimicrobials. And that's where I think it's like, I go back and forth, like testing is important because I've seen people just start antimicrobials on people who have very low beneficial bacteria. And if we support it, they might have like a little bit of overgrowth, but the symptoms can be mimicking. 100%. And poor digestive enzymes, poor digestive capacity, low stomach acid can create a lot of SIBO-like symptoms, right? It's so important that we are not just saying, okay, I have some of these things are flagged, because the immune system is robust. And when we can support the immune system and beneficial bacteria in the right amounts, we don't always need to bring in killers, right? We can just support the body's natural defense system.
Right. But, I posted a case like this. It was probably a few weeks ago, and this person had come from a coach that was, and a couple people that were running SIBO protocols, they had no commensal bacteria. It was like low across the board. I'm like, you do not need a SIBO protocol. I'm like, no wonder you can't digest any food, right?
Yeah.
So of
Yeah.
course they're distended, they're bloated, they're waking up bloated even, which is pretty SIBO-esque,
Yes.
right? But that's because they're fucking constipated and they have no bacteria to break down food, right? So if the bottom line there is if you do want to run extensive protocol, we're talking about killers, right? Antimicrobials,
Yes.
test, test. But I'm with you. Like a lot of the time, I kind of have flipped the way that I test a lot of people in that like I do stuff first before I test a lot of the time, unless I have a lot of background information and they've already gone through some things and they've like done some stuff that's more specific to their issues. Then I might just test.
With people like who are coming in, so people I test right away is like Crohn's, UC, things like gastroparesis. We've talked about this. Things where somebody might have like IBD, IBS, IBD, like that. IBS is kind of like, but IBD, these things that are like real like gut diseases, things like that. I will most likely always test right away because I'm assuming we have some sort of bacterial infection going on there that has been untreated and maybe didn't get flagged in a breath test, or some sort of like issue going on there, And then I'm like you now, I kind of like just kind of work on like the very basics and then see, It's
so
we're not very black or white people.
Right. Yeah. So let's transition a little bit because you said the word breath test. So we'll talk about what a breath test is because that's probably our third one in the toolbox here. So if you go to a doctor or a GI doc and you get any type of GI test, if they'll do it, the things that they're probably gonna, if they test stool, they're probably testing for like infections. So like E. coli, potentially like C. diff, perhaps, right? The test for things like that. They are not running a GI map usually. They're not testing for overall, like a broad, right. They're not testing for like a broad spectrum. They're testing for things that are going to give you like diarrhea and quickly, stuff like that they would treat with an antibiotic a lot of times, what they want to do. So just keep that in mind. Other things that a GI doc could potentially do would be a breath test, which we can also do this if we want. And a breath test is going to essentially look at, are you seeing increases in levels of hydrogen or methane specific bacteria essentially, or lactulose or glucose or however, depending on which test you get. So what we would look for is like in the charts, these are a little funky to read, but if you've seen them a few times, it'll kind of show you like if you're having an increase over, it's normally like 20 parts per million on the life extension one, and most of the other ones are pretty similar. In a certain time frame, you probably have SIBO. So what's happening is the solution that you're taking is reaching the small intestine, it's fermenting, you're like breathing this stuff out, essentially is what's happening.
Yeah.
Some people that have really extreme SIBO even have like SIBO breath, right? Like you can smell it.
Yeah.
So they'll have like methane breath.
Pylori breath.
H. pylori breath. Right.
Candida, yeast, a lot of the,
Yeah. So breath tests, the limitations of breath tests obviously is it's very specific. It's just testing for SIBO. The upside to a breath test, it is testing for SIBO. Yeah. So there's that. Now, I think that it could definitely be useful in certain cases. Like I've used breath tests for follow-up cases a lot where like we've had a SIBO case and we've gone through protocols and we've worked through things and then we want to do a follow-up and maybe not spend all the money on the GI map because maybe all that we were really looking for was the SIBO, so we just do the breath tests.
Yeah.
So, and you could do breath tests as a first option as well, but you're missing out on some things.
I always say like it shows us why. So like, okay, you have this overgrown.
Right.
But why? Like, is it because of like low pancreatic enzymes? Is it because of like, what is your gallbladder looking like? Because we see this in estrogen dominance cases as well. There's an influence on estrogen and the gallbladder.
Right.
Is that, and we see this, I've seen this a lot more common in perimenopausal, menopausal, like in that, like closer to like going through like the real menopausal. I know we say perimenopausal is this like long strain out,
Right.
but you'll see this with big swings in estrogen. You can even see this in bodybuilders who are not mitigating their estrogen. You know what I mean? When the estrogen swings high and low frequently, the gallbladder gets affected. And when the gallbladder gets infected, breakdown of fat doesn't happen. Like there's so many systems that are, it's like dominoes falling. And so where did that domino fall? How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we make sure that we are not just, you know, getting rid of the bacteria, but we're preventing the reoccurrence of the bacteria as well, right? Like, and this is even where I go back and forth about like, if I'm using biofilm disruptors or not, like specific instances where maybe something's going to be more specific, like beneficial, like even if DIM is effective or different, it's like there's so many different influencing factors. When we look at the whole GI map, we get a full picture of like what the entire system looks like.
Right.
Whereas the breath test is very specific to specific bacteria, and there's overgrowth that can happen that will not show up on a breath test.
Correct. So if you're going to go through the process of taking a test and you're going to spend the money and you've already worked on a lot of the foundational stuff, just get a GI map.
Yeah.
Probably. Now, if it's never like I will have the occasional person that has a doctor or something or a GI doc that's going to play ball, and they'll run a breath test and stuff. It's still good information.
Normally,
it's still
functional doctors more open to that too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so it's definitely not out of the question. But like if I'm choosing, that's probably not where I'm going to go right off the bat. You know, other nice things are breath tests are at home, taken at home normally, unless you're going to a doctor. That's good, but it shows a GI map, so that's kind of a moot point.
Yeah.
So in any of this you can order. We have access to all three of the tests, you know, serum, GI, and breath tests. So we have access to all those. So there's really no limitations there. Yeah, so I mean, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, testing is. I honestly am a big test, don't guess kind of person.
Yeah.
But I think that which is kind of like we're reiterating this stuff. I think that you can work on the foundations first and then see if symptoms improve. I think is always like the first step if you're looking to save money, you know?
Yeah.
And then the second thing is really understanding or working with someone who understands. Even if you're not going to work with a coach, we do consultations. You can work, there's a lot of different options, but understanding what the GI map really means, so you're not freaking out on one thing and then throwing 200 killers on it and then wondering why you're not getting better. There's so many small details to pay attention to there. Yeah. Yeah,
for sure. So make sure, I'm always, like I said, with a lot of the gut cases, when we're doing something similar, it's always like, work on these basic things, then what's left over after that.
Yeah.
You know, work on what is left over, because and you brought up some other great points too when considering testing. Other things to consider would be, it's probably a good idea if you're doing any type of microbial testing to have, even if your diet's not great, to have something that's at least consistent for at least like 5 to 7 days leading up. That way we're going to get a pretty good idea of your normal environment. So that's important. Making sure that you're testing and doing these tests on days that are more normal for you. Like, what does a typical day look like, right?
Yeah.
Not like after you went out and ate a large pizza the night before.
I go through the Dutch test. They're like, I'm going to do it on the weekend because it's so much more relaxing. I was like, I need to see you on a Monday morning.
Yeah,
or a Wednesday or something, you know?
Right. What's the Monday through Friday look like when you're pissed off? Like, can we see that?
Yeah. Exactly. That's, Because all of these tests are, you know, there's some things that are going to be, I mean, like testosterone's only going to change so much.
And
like,
so
your cortisol level will change drastically, you know, and your gut is level, but it will have some sort of influence. So the more consistent you can be, even with your lab testing, it's so important. I just went through this with a client. She was like, my liver, you know, it was like 1 point over, you know, it's like 31, which is really not, you know. And I was like, did you train the day before? And she was like, oh yeah, I forgot you told me not to train. I was like, okay, you know.
Yeah. So all those things are important. So if you are working with a coach or there's instructions, those things are important to follow. The tests are not cheap, so don't screw them up.
Yeah. And even if you like try to like, hey, I messed it up, like they're not really like, oh, no problem. I'll just go ahead and send you another one.
Do you, and we can kind of close it off with this because I'm sure someone's going to wonder. I mean, I get asked this sometimes.
Yeah.
Uh,
And if people have questions, feel free to ask.
yeah, sure. Thoughts on retesting. So let's say, because again, we're talking another budget thing here as well.
Yeah.
And let's talk about, this is especially on GI maps. So in more extensive cases, we're actually doing a GI map. Blood work, like we probably are testing that throughout the year at least a couple points anyhow. So GI mapping, we get the GI map, we've run some type of protocol, whatever it is. Do we retest or do we not retest? And I have it depends answer on that one as well.
It really depends. It depends on finances. I've never even retested myself. Like, oh, to make sure it's done. I've retested like, something ain't right again, and normally I'm right on that. But symptoms are everything to me. There's always probably some area of improvement. We're like, oh, we could just do a little bit here and a little bit there. But for the most part, if someone is feeling better, I do not retest. Now, the caveat to that is if we use antibiotics instead of antimicrobials. Because the reinoculation period where we're refeeding, where we're going up, antibiotics are a little tricky, especially if we haven't ran biofilms. The amount of time we need to run biofilms is a little bit different. Antibiotics don't address some of that. Which antibiotics were ran? Do we have now a situation where we have now very low normal flora, normal like good guys, and then do we have a little bit of bad guys still left over? Do we still have H. pylori? Like there's things that antibiotics do not treat. And it's really important when dealing with antibiotics, because I've seen them not improve with multiple settings. And so like, I just have a case that I took on, and you and I were talking about this. This person had run multiple rounds of antibiotics, but was still having an overgrowth. And this becomes are you having an overgrowth because we're missing, we need to stop killing and we need to start supporting more? Where there are biofilms that weren't taken care of? Like there's so many factors that go into it. I've reran my antibiotics cases. I normally will rerun just to make sure. But again, It's really on budget. If somebody feels great, I don't push it. I'm like, hey,
Sure.
We can rerun it just to make sure. But I've swung back and forth with antibiotics, and I feel like we still end up having to go in and clean up post antibiotic.
Yeah.
So
you're dealing with, like, to give you guys an example, a common GI specific antibiotic would be like rifaximin, right? It's like a lot of people use that. So one of the issues, like what Sonia's kind of alluding to, is a lot of these back end stuff, like, mucosal lining, biofilms that need broken up to actually release the bacteria that we need to kill. So if you guys aren't familiar, a lot of the bacteria is housed in these biofilms, which are like literal, like protective layers. Yeah. Right. So
they're really
cool. Right. They're really cool. They're a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
But part of our protocols are often breaking up these biofilms to release the extra bacteria that we need to kill off. So one of the downsides with antibiotics is it's a short course, and it's so like quick and harsh that a lot of the time those biofilms don't have time to release. So if you're using a biofilm to support, or maybe you didn't, after the antibiotic's done, there's still a whole bunch of stuff housed in there that you missed, right? So
and
it's real great.
2 weeks. And biofilm disruptors need about 8 to 12.
Right. So it's really great after that 2 weeks when a lot of your symptoms are kind of gone. But then like 2 weeks after that, or a month after that, you're like, oh no.
Back again.
All my symptoms are back because now you've dumped a bunch of bacteria from our biofilms.
And you wiped all the good guys, so they have no support.
Correct. So whereas with an antimicrobial protocol, it's kind of like time matched because antimicrobials are generally a lot longer, so it's kind of all works and coordinates with one another.
Yeah.
So I do agree with you 100% on that. And another thing that we weren't really talking about this, but another thing with antibiotics is like you still should be running other supports that you would run with an antimicrobial protocol. Like all this other antibiotics just killing bacteria. Like it's not doing any of the other stuff.
No, yeah. And like, I think if you are going to go on an antibiotic route, if that's what you've chosen, okay. I feel like this is like a birth control talk sometimes with antibiotics, like shaming around doing that. Like it's whatever it is your choice. You really need to work on, I would spend like a week or two to just work on healing and sealing the gut lining, because there's such an inflammatory response when you go in hard and start taking something like rifaximin. The die-off is awful, and you shouldn't be experiencing die-off. You should be sealing the gut first, because that die-off can also trigger things like Hashimoto's, other autoimmune diseases, cytokine storms inside of the body. It can trigger some of this stuff. So just like keep that in mind, even when running antimicrobials, that the first 1 to 2 weeks should be maybe even that you're dealing with clients sealing and healing the gut while you're waiting for the stuff to come in. Like you can already be doing things like aloe juice, glutamine, bone broth, collagens that are helping. So when you do go in with antimicrobials or antibiotics, you're not having the magnitude of die-off where a person is feeling like they have the flu, or it's triggering other autoimmune issues inside of the body, which is not uncommon with die-off symptoms.
Right. And a lot of these people already are borderline autoimmune issues anyhow. So like you just fucking open the floodgates to hell. Right.
Yeah, it's literally like, and so when we talked about gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria, you don't need to know like what every strain is. But the fact is some of these specific bacteria have a shell over them, and when they die, they create an endotoxin. And if we have leaky gut, think about that. That endotoxin goes
leaks through that layer, that permeability.
Yep, a cytokine storm. The body starts attacking it. Now we're dealing with massive inflammation. Inflammation is a trigger for all illnesses, right? It's also the healing factor, right? Okay, how do we heal almost anything? Well, let's remove some inflammation, and normally symptoms improve at least by 20%. So think about that too, as like a bigger picture thing, that like there's a reason why some of these things are like set in place. But I think one of the things I see get missed a lot, and even as a newer coach I missed as well, was spending a little bit of extra time in the beginning to heal and seal the gut to prevent these issues further along.
Yeah, that would be maybe more of a protocol talk, but I kind of do the same thing where I'm like run versus an antimicrobial protocol. You run a lot of that stuff in conjunction, where I'm like, I'm going to do more front end before the antibiotic starts type thing. But totally agree. Yeah. So that's a really good one if you're wanting to retest some good information for you. But I think that covers most of the ins and outs of testing. I will repost this as well. So we'll have part 1 and part 2.
I know.
But
I don't know what happened.
it'll work.
We made it through.
I have no idea, but we made it work.
Yeah, have a good rest of the day.
You too. We'll see you.